All right, good morning and welcome to another Grain Talk webinar. Today we'll be talking about soil health with Dr. Laura Van Eerd and Anne Verhallen. We're going to run through our webinar just really quickly, some housekeeping stuff, and then we'll get ready and we'll get rolling through it. So our agenda today, so we're going to do this introduction. We're going to talk with Laura Van Eerd about the 6 C's for soil health, answer some questions, and then we'll move on and we'll speak with Anne Verhallen about soil health and soil management. And then we'll answer some questions there as well. Just some housekeeping items. This webinar will be recorded and posted on the Grain Farmers of Ontario YouTube website. We will have a question and answer period, so you can ask questions anytime in the chat box. If something comes up and you don't want to forget it, type it in the chat box and then that way you've got it. So what Grain Talk is. So Grain Farmers of Ontario has launched a new way to communicate with our farmer members. We want to recognize the important information that we have and kind of put it out there so that it's easy to find. So this includes podcasts, e-newsletters, webinars, research days, market trend reports. So the Grain Talk webinar series, it's to introduce the latest advancements to our farmer members as they relate to high yielding production, time relevant information to when the particular management concept or practice would be employed in the field, and to provide a forum which allows communication with industry level experts on particular topics of interest. It's also to help gain further feedback from our farmer members and CCAs to better understand production issues that hinder the ability to be sustainable.
Yeah, we'd like to introduce Dr. Laura Van Eerd. Laura is a professor of sustainable soil management at the University of Guelph Richtown campus. She grew up in southwestern Ontario on a cash crop farm that raised corn, soybeans, winter wheat, and edible beans, as well as finishing hogs. The goal of her internationally recognized research program is to enhance the understanding of management on nitrogen and carbon cycling in agricultural systems. She has published over 50 peer-reviewed papers. She is a recipient of the Caring for Ontario's Land and Water Award for her excellence in research. In addition to numerous invited talks nationally and internationally, her research contributed to key policy documents on soil health and cover crops. Dr. Van Eerd has supervised nearly 20 senior HQPs and was recognized for her mentoring with the Piplato Teaching Excellence Award. Also speaking today will be Anne. Anne is a soil science graduate from the University of Guelph. Anne has worked for OMAFRA since 1988, starting as a soil conservation advisor working in Essex and Kent. Currently, Anne works in the area of soil management with projects in a wide variety of areas such as erosion, compaction, and cover crops. Promoting the use of cover crops and supporting better soil health are her passions.
We'll pass it over to Dr. Laura Van Eerd to go through her 6 C's for soil health.
Excellent, thank you. And thank you for that introduction. So you've likely heard about 4R nutrient management, nutrient stewardship. So now I'm proposing a new acronym, the 6 C's for soil health. There we go. So C for carbon, but also we have the C's for these different cornerstones shown here. And all of these best management practices start with C. And I want to put this soil health in terms of carbon and in terms of yields. So greater yields and consistent. And by consistent yields, we're talking about the ability to withstand extreme weather years. Too much rain or too little rain. So if we're talking carbon, we have to talk about plants and photosynthesis. So that's trapping of carbon dioxide. So that our carbon inputs are from plants, whether you feed it to livestock first and then return it to the soil. Those are our inputs. Our outputs are what you take away from your field. So the yield, potentially crop residue removal, but also think about carbon loss in terms of soil leaving your field. And all of this, the plant-driven carbon storage is mediated by microbes that are pushing the carbon into the soil. Okay, so starting with these 6 C's for soil health. First one's continuous living plants. So you're thinking alfalfa, pasture, growing something, capturing sunlight through photosynthesis. Next up, compost and other organic amendments that you add to your soil. And I've put here a picture of keeping the crop residue in the field. Next, if you know me, you know I'm going to be talking about cover crops. So growing plants and capturing carbon in the off season. Next, crop diversity. In our temperate climate, it's small grains, adding winter wheat to your rotation, benefiting soil health. And now conservation tillage. So this one you'll notice is a lighter color because you have to use a fair bit of caution when we're talking about conservation tillage and soil health. We know that there are situations where tillage is an advantage, where tillage benefits soil health. And so we can't use a blanket statement when we talk about conservation tillage. For instance, tillage can be helpful. It can be not helpful as well, but tillage can be helpful in reducing compaction. And I've got this as a different color as well because I haven't done any research on this work, but I include this as one of the 6 C's because anything that enhances crop growth can enhance our carbon capture. So we're going to move on with these different capstones, as I call it, and we'll look at a few of the different ones. Starting first with cover crops. So I've got a long-term cover crop experiment that started in 2007. So in total, we've got 25 trials that we've conducted, and we've planted cover crops 143 times. And 98% of the times we had yields, crop yields, that were as good as or better with the cover crop than without. So over those 11 years, we're seeing a yield boost in some situations. Now we can take that and look at soil health. So we've measured after 6 years of annual cover cropping in a vegetable and grain system. We planted the cover crops and we see an increase in soil organic carbon with the different cover crops compared to the no cover crop. So an increase of almost 0.5%. So this is significant. And when we take this crop data, this carbon data, and we plot it against tomato yield, we see that as soil carbon increases, so does tomato yield. So that's in the top left-hand side of your screen, and that was in 2006, which was a hot, dry growing seasons. So the benefits of soil health were showing up with better soil yields, with better yields, crop yields. Now, in 2015, this lower right-hand side, we didn't see any relationship with soil health, soil organic carbon compared to crop yield. But this is a relatively short amount of time, right? 6 times we planted these annual cover crops, and we could see an increase in soil organic carbon, soil health. So, and then I just talked about yield. So why don't we put it all together and talk about profits? So here in the middle, we've got the ratio of profit margin. So I worked with Danny Myers, MSc student with Richard Vine, the economist here at Ridgetown campus, and using our long-term cover crop experiments from 2008 and 15, and then we've got a repeated trial from 2009 to 2016. So over those years, we've got 8 crop years, and she took the profit margins from all of the vegetable crops. So over those 8 years, we had 4 years of processing veg. She took the profit margins, so the ratio. So if it's 1, then cover crops with yield with cover crops is the same as without. And in this case, I'm showing profit margin. So if it's above the red line, then profits were higher. If it's below, then profits were lower. And so what we saw in our experiment was that the profit margins when we grew processing veg crops on average were 7 to 16% greater profit margins. Now I have to put this into context. There was 2 of those 4 years we were growing tomatoes, so that definitely impacts your profit margins. And then the other thing is because rye overwinters, you need to terminate. And so the cost of a glyphosate application pre-plant was included in the profit margins. Now, I imagine most of you guys will use a burn down pre-plant. But in this scenario, the cost of the application of the herbicide was included in the profit margins. So whether you want to account for that in your cover crop or whether it's just part of your management. So we'll leave that. So that's processing vegetables dominated by tomatoes. So what about grain crops? Well, in grain crops, we're lower profit margins, 7 to 13% lower profit margins. Okay, so keep in mind, we still have the burn down that's attributed to the rye, cereal rye cover crop. The other thing was in these 4 years that we grew grain crops, we had 2 years with wheat. So you guys know the profits on wheat. So we had 2 years of wheat, 1 year of grain corn, 1 year of soybeans. So all we can do is do the profit margins based on our experiment, based on our yields and the costs at the time period. I'm happy to let you know that there is funded through the Grain Farmers of Ontario, along with federal and provincial funding, to look at cover crops in a grain system. So side-by-side comparisons of different cropping systems, corn, soybeans, winter wheat. And part of that analysis will include profit margins, and that's with Dr. Minesh at Guelph, Dr. Bill, and Dr. Dave. So experiments at Elora and Ridgetown. All right, so given this, let's move on to grain systems. And again, if we're talking soil health, we need to talk about long-term research to look at the impact on soil health. So here's an overview of the long-term experiment at Ridgetown, managed by Dr. David Hooker. So this was established in 1995, and it's designed to look at different cropping rotations, different type of tillage. We have winter wheat with red clover, and as well, there's some nitrogen treatments. Okay, so looking at soil health, here we have the Cornell Soil Health Test. So this takes 15 different parameters and it combines it into one score. The higher the score, the better the soil health. And we can see here, when soil samples were taken in the bluegrass fence row, higher soil health. And as well, the adding winter wheat into the rotation increases soil health compared to systems without soil health. Next, we can look at the impact of tillage. So here, when this data was collected, we were in a no-till system versus fall plow. We see higher soil health based on the Cornell Soil Health Test with no-till compared to conventional. Now, we have to use a fair bit of caution with this data because all of the soil health tests are to the 6-inch depth. We know that the tillage and plowing, that there's impacts below that 6-inch. So be cautious when you see this data. It's not just what's going on in the top 6 inches. You have to consider lower depths. What I can tell you is that when we sampled at the long-term tillage and crop rotation trial at Ridgetown, when we sampled to the 1 meter depth, winter wheat increased soil organic carbon to that depth. All right, so we see the value of winter wheat in the rotation. So how does that soil health relate to yield? Well, I have to credit David Hooker for this data and this slide. Now, before you get all worried about 150 bushels, so this is corn yield, and 150 bushels might have you worried, except for when I tell you that this data comes from soil, from plots where there's been no nitrogen fertilizer added for 18 consecutive years. Now, there might have been some starter fertilizer, but no side dress for 18 years. So on average, this is corn yield on average for 4 years, from 2010 to 13. And look at the value of winter wheat in the rotation. The yield boost with winter wheat, and then another yield boost with red clover in the rotation. That is due to soil health. So we see where we've got the lowest yields. There is lowest soil quality in terms of organic matter in the Cornell soil health test. And there's lower available nitrogen, potentially mineralizable nitrogen. Where we have the higher yields with winter wheat in the rotation, we have better soil health. And in fact, we also see less reliance on fertilizer nitrogen with winter wheat in those rotations. And that, in my mind, and I know I'm biased because I study soils, but it's based to that better soil health, more organic matter, better cycling. And that soil health, we can relate it to crop yields. So here we have soil organic carbon. So that's like your organic matter. So the higher your soil organic carbon, higher your average corn yields. So this data here is from Richtown. It's a 5-year corn average, and it's from the continuous corn system. And that's the average. Each of the data plot is from with and without nitrogen fertilizer in a continuous corn system, with and without tillage. All right, so on average, your yields 5 years goes up if you have better soil health. And as well, that relates, better soil health relates to crop stability. So the more soil organic carbon, the less variation in yield over those 5 years. So over those 5 years, you had some wet years, some dry years, but your yield was more stable in those extreme weather years when you had good soil health. That's that protection, that's the resiliency that good soil can provide in terms of yields. So this is at Richtown. Let's look at Elora. So here's data from Elora. You can see at the x-axis, we're going to compare alfalfa, so that's continuously living, to more diverse systems, and then eventually we'll get to winter wheat and with red clover. Okay, so the pictures here, this is an incubation study, 24 hours, where you put your soil in with some moisture and you measure carbon dioxide and ammonia that's come off. There's a little paddle in your vial, and then there's a color change and you read it on the meter that's shown there. So Sylvita and SLAN are commercially available tests. And again, the higher the value, the greater the soil health. And the thought there is that with healthier soil, you can have more microbial activity, more access to available carbon, to active carbon. All right, so that's the background. Let's see the data. So in alfalfa, we've got higher, based on this soil health test, higher values with SLAN and Sylvita, and it decreases as you go across. And this corn, soybean rotation has the lowest values, And we attribute that lower soil health because soybeans do not leave a lot of plant residue in the soil, do not leave a lot in your field. When you add rotations with winter wheat, you see the soil health increase with winter wheat, and sometimes we can measure increases with the red clover. Okay, so we're seeing the value of winter wheat, we're seeing the value of continuous planting of red clover cover crops. Again, at Elora, this relates to protection against those extreme weather years. So better corn yields, better soybean yields in the cool wet or the hot dry. Again, that's soil protection. And then when you add red clover to the rotation, then you're seeing resiliency. That's better protection in those extreme years. So we have both at Elora and at Richtown, we're seeing how those improvements of soil health relate to yield and relate to weather. So there you have it again, our 6 C's: carbon-driven, carbon contributing to your soil, and best management practices that all begin with C. Again, because you're building plants into the system when you might not otherwise have it in terms of cover crops. We're going to use caution when we talk about conservation tillage, because there's definitely scenarios where tillage can be beneficial. I didn't talk about compaction. I haven't done that research, but I'm happy to let you know that the grain farmers, in partnership with the Ontario Agri-Food Innovation Alliance, are starting Project 2019 with my colleague, Dr. Richard Heck, and many others to look at compaction and its impact on yields and soil health. And I really look forward to those results. So I'm going to end there by acknowledging the people and agencies and the funders. I'll thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Laura. We just have a few questions coming in.
Laura, just wondering about soil health and, a lot of discussion about rotation in the crops, and that is the feed for the microbes in the soil. Has there been any work done as far as analyzing, really healthy soils, and what is the colonization of the microbes in the soil, and what species are there compared to other soils? Just wondering if that is a component as well.
Great question, Marty. So in my long-term cover crop trial, we collaborated with Dr. Carrie Dunfield. She's a soil microbiologist, and we have seen some differences with the cover crops compared to the no cover crop. But it's not as exciting as one might think, right? So we can't just say that with the cover crop, you have more microbes than without. It just changes who's there. So, but it's in my system, it hasn't changed the function of those microbes. So that work where the graduate student is just finishing up, and then she has other graduate students who are working like at Elora and in other systems to try to get to that microbial interaction. The good news is our soils are quite resistant, and there's a lot of redundancy. Yeah, functional redundancy in our soil.
So Laura, just to add to that, just thinking, with corn silage, a lot of times there's bad bacteria and good bacteria, and a lot of times we inoculate corn silage in order to get more lactobacillus and have better ensiling process. So that's not the case with soils, then, that there's bad bacteria in the soil, that it may take a longer period of time for matter to accumulate based on your cropping systems. There's nothing really proving any benefit at this point in time?
Yeah, Marty, I wouldn't go good versus bad. So I think of soil, and I didn't get into this, and maybe I should have, but I think of soil health as your ability of the soil to function. So can it grow a crop? Can it cycle nutrients well? Can it hold water and have good air exchange? And all of those type of things go into the function of the soil. And so with microbes, and maybe there's an opportunity to invite Carrie to do a webinar to talk more specifically. And Lori Phillips would be a great researcher. It's not good versus bad. And a lot of times there's shifts in who's there, but if they're all functioning, then things are good in your soil. And there you go. I just said good when I said don't say good or bad.
Well, that's a great explanation, actually, and with soil health too, about soil porosity, and there's a lot of different factors that make a healthy soil. Very good answer, Laura. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I think one of the best indicators in my mind is that in these extreme weather years, like in Richtown, we just got 6 inches of rain in 3 days. How long is your water ponding?
Yes.
There you go. Okay, so that gets to infiltration rate, and I think I'll turn it over to Anne.
Okay, so Marty's questions were a great segue to the approach I took for this talk. As far as soil health means that there's soil management decisions that have to be made. And having the research there really helps you to give some base to it. But there's a lot of other things. So more recently, soil health has been a really hot topic with lots of claims being made about it'll do virtually everything for you. And as much as I really love my soil and I love cover crops and I have a real passion for all those things, it is not just the whole panacea for everything that's wrong out in a field. So there's more to it than that. And actually, as we've seen with one of the projects looking at precision ag, you can have really good soil health and yet still not have great yields in some areas of fields. So let's get into that a little bit more in detail. We need to talk about soil health versus the actual soil resource. What kind of texture do we have? What's the depth of the A horizon? So you can see in the profile here, and this is actually a Berrien sandy loam, that you can have some quite large variations in a horizon, and that's going to have an impact on your rooting and on your crop performance, how much moisture that root system can access, and the subsoil. And it's kind of cool that this is a Berrien, because Berriens are very typical of having a sandy, loamy type of topsoil, but their subsoil tends to be more clay-based, which means that they're incredibly productive soils if well managed and well drained for things like processing tomatoes and some high-value crops, because it's got the kind of soil that it has the topsoil that's going to allow the roots to expand and make full advantage of the soil resource, but at the same time, it's got a subsoil that's going to hold moisture and make it quite available. The other thing we have to consider is the natural drainage and the variability across the field. When you talk to growers, if you ask them, is your field consistent? Everybody has a field. Almost, I can't think of too many fields, period, that are consistent. And you can really see this up until we started getting rain a couple of days ago. And even yesterday up in Bruce County, it was dramatic. Any place that had a gravelly bottom, suddenly we had corn that looked like pineapples. If you've got natural drainage that's heavily clay-based, there's lots of areas this year where you can see tile-run wheat, beans, or corn. And that comes back to the natural drainage. We can tile it, but it's not going to change it that much. You still have to work with the actual soil that you've been given, and we know that there's huge variability across the field. So soil management takes soil health and blends that soil resource, soil quality together, and there's some hard decisions that have to be made. And I should stay on track with what I have. I can get too passionate about this. So beyond the soil resource, there's also been a lot of changes in the landscape and in our farming practices, and it's still quite visible in a lot of farms. It's good that we've got the research that Laura was talking about with the importance of the 6 C's, but there's been some other things going on, and it really points up the value of some of the research that they've been doing. If you look at this chart, it shows the increase of annual crops. So you think about, we've got a lot more soys and edible beans, and as Laura pointed out, soybeans really are not very kind to the soil. We tend to see lower soil health, and we really actually have a net negative as far as carbon. If you think about it, we've got soybeans in the ground. They're a very short season crop. We don't get a lot of residue from them. They've got, as I would say in technical terms, a really wussy root system. So they're really not leaving too much. At the same time, there's always that cycling of organic matter in the soil. And actually under a soybean crop, most soils, we're going to have more decomposition of the organic matter that's inherently in the soil than we're going to have return from the soybeans. So that's why I tend to have a bit of a rant about soybeans. But we've seen it more and more that we have more soybeans in the rotation and much less perennial crops or wheat, things that are going to leave roots in there for a longer period of time. Going back to, again, one of the C's that Laura was talking about with the continuous living root systems. And we are seeing the impact. Here's a chart that was put together from one of my colleagues, Christine Brown, and with the help of the SGS labs out of Guelph, looking at the change in our soil organic matter over a 15-year period. This is just all soil samples that went into that lab, all Ontario. And you can see that over that time period, we've had a small, slight decrease. That decrease is a little misleading, shall we say, because in that time period is when we started to get into nutrient management. And many livestock producers who have manure, and many of them also have forages in their rotation, were having to send more soil samples in. So we are heavily weighted to the livestock industry in these soil samples, and we're still seeing a net decrease in soil organic matter. And then I need to zero in on the counties that I call near and dear to myself for as far as home. And it's even more so in the far southwestern counties, the ones that tend to have some of the heavier clays that are very responsive to organic matter. And you can see that the drop in organic matter is that much more severe. It's an area with a lot of row crops and, of course, a lot of soybeans. And the challenge with soil health is that it can be really subtle. This is a close-up of a plowed field. From the road, it didn't look that bad. This is a field that has been in a seed corn and tomato rotation, no cover crops, lots of tillage, and after a wet harvest, the grower just wasn't happy with his drainage, and so he went through and he plowed it. If you look at this, you can see the platiness. You can see the layers of soil that have been setting up here. And this creates a barrier to water and to the crop roots. And it's going to decrease that resilience of that field period over time. And it can be subtle. And it kind of creeps up on you too. When I was younger, I don't remember headlands holding water the way they do now. Part of that is probably because we had more diverse rotations back when the dinosaurs walked the earth and I was a young person. But typically we expect to see standing water in headlands. Everybody will just slough it off and go, oh, it's a headland. But maybe it's time to reevaluate the productivity of those headlands. And I'm really pleased to see a number of seed corn fields and tomato fields, at least in this area, where the headlands are now planted to a cover crop, at least during the year that it's in production with seed corn or tomatoes. Because you are losing some productivity with that. We tend to see really rough crops in that area, and they don't have the resilience. And Laura said she wasn't going to talk a whole lot about compaction, but let's dive into that a little bit more deeply. And this is some of the stuff that you're going to see come out of that project that she was talking about with Dr. Richard Heck. He does this kind of imagery in addition to the other work that he's doing, and it's really fascinating. So if you look at the image on the left-hand side of your screen where it talks about pre-impact, take a look at those blobs. You can see that there's a lot of pore space. This is before the compaction event. that Bruno et al. Did. And then if you look to the right, post-impact. But what are we seeing? Well, right off the bat, usually when I use this slide at meetings, the answer I'll get is, well, we've lost a lot of pore space. That's what we expect. That's what you were seeing with that headland picture that I was showing you earlier. But it's more than that. It's more than just more dense soil. More importantly, the thing we've lost is connections. We've lost those connected pores. And that's really important for getting water moving through the soil and also roots. And that really is what we were seeing in that headland picture. What really is soil health? Ag Canada defines it as the soil's fitness to support crop growth without becoming degraded or otherwise harming the environment. But what it really comes down to is soil function. Does it do what it's supposed to do? Does it grow a crop? Does it stay in place under a heavy rainstorm? Admittedly, if you get 6 inches, there's not much that's going to stay in place. And does it drain properly? So I want you to think about it a little bit differently. Soil health requires management, and it's really a maintenance program. And that's what creates resilience. And I was thinking about this talk on the weekend, and we were getting ready to bale some straw. And that's quite the ordeal at times, right? And it was pretty warm and all that. So I was thinking about what are all the steps that the guys go through as they're getting organized to get the wagons and the equipment out to the field. And I watched my husband, and of course he fueled tractors and he greased everything. My brother-in-law was very careful to blow all the screens out so we wouldn't have any fires, because not fun. And of course, my nephew grabbed the fire extinguisher just in case, because his uncle has been known to burn the occasional tractor. And there's a number of different steps to make sure that they were successful. There was maintenance and there was preparation. So if you think about your soil is your greatest resource, or one of your most valuable resources. Probably the only thing that's more valuable is the people that work the farm. And you do all you can to plan and prepare. We wouldn't leave a tractor without doing maintenance, just like my brother-in-law wouldn't have let us go to the field without blowing off all the screens that were plugged. So it's important to do that maintenance to maintain soil health. I know coming out of 2019, it's been a really rough year for a lot of tough decisions. Things that were done when guys are telling me it was 2019 fit, where you know that things got planted more than a little on the wet side, doing things you would never do any other year in order to get the crop in. So tough years make for tough decisions, but there needs to be the overall plan. And that's really the key with soil health. Having that plan for maintenance to make sure that you've got the diverse rotations in there to build that resilience. That plan for reducing tillage wherever you can. That plan to make sure that you've got cover crops in there. So let's take a closer look at one of these decisions. We're going to go through a bit of a math exercise. This is a call that I got recently. It came up, a question from a grower. So, and actually in that case, it was rye straw. I've got an option to sell my wheat straw. Typically, I leave it. Which is going to be better for my soil organic matter? Do I leave it, or do I sell it and then use the money that I'm paid in order to buy some cattle manure? Because I have the option of doing that. So we went through the math. If we had wheat straw and we just leave it, and for the sake of ease of math, I said, how about 5,000 pounds of wheat straw off per acre? That's pretty heavy, and if we assume that wheat straw's got about a seed-to-N ratio of approximately 60:1, that's about 3,000 pounds of carbon. And if 20% of that becomes stable, and that's based on Dr. Baroni's work, so roughly 600 pounds of carbon is plus the nutrients that are in the straw is being returned to the soil. Now, if we look at it the other way, with the wheat straw, if we were to sell it and use the dollars to buy manure, well, for one thing, anybody who's baled knows that you don't get everything. Not all the straw is going to be removed through baling. And hopefully a lot of the chaff will stay behind anyways. And if you were to apply 8 to 10 tons per acre of cattle manure, and if you look at that website that I've referenced at the bottom, there's a really good Crop Talk article from Christine Brown. She calculates that you've got about 90 pounds of carbon per ton of manure. Then we're getting 720 to 900 pounds of carbon added, plus again, any nutrients coming through with the cattle manure. So which one's really better? Well, I really like the option of, if you can get a good price for the wheat straw, once in a while, it doesn't hurt to sell it. Sell the wheat straw, buy the manure. Oh, and buy a cover crop too at the same time, because it'll take up the nutrients from the manure, and you're returning the carbon, you're returning some nutrients, you're adding the amendments, so you're kind of turbocharging the biology, and you've added in some more living roots. One of those C's that Laura was talking about was continuous living roots. And I know a lot of people who are excited about soil health talk a lot about living roots. I'm like, why the heck do they keep on about this living root thing? Well, cover crops and diverse rotations ensure that we have more living roots. And the important part around living roots is those root exudates. The root exudates are complex carbohydrates and sugars. And that's what feeds the biology, feeds the earthworms, feeds the bacteria, feeds everybody down there. And it's called rhizodeposition. And there's research out there that says that it can account for 33% of the carbon that is laid down by the cover crop. Kind of a big deal. Plus, this is pretty stable stuff. And the same research paper showed that over time, and in this case, they were looking at 5 months, the below ground cover crop inputs were 3 times more likely to remain in the soil. So a large part of that carbon that's being returned is coming from the roots, having those living roots there. And it's the stuff that's going to stay there. But how do you know if you're gaining? Well, Laura talked about a number of different soil tests you could do, whether it's the Cornell test or Solvita. Some of those are commercially available here. There's also Vitalis from A&L. There's a number of different soil health tests we can do. And of course, there's the basic one around organic matter, which we'll get into in a minute. Some of the other things, as far as tracking soil health on your farm, look at yields over time. We've got lots of yield monitors out there. Lay out those maps and take a look. Are you gaining? Are there certain areas that are always poorly performing? Then go out and dig. Figure out why they're poorly performing. Is it something you can actually change? Or is it the fact that, 3 feet down, there's a gravel layer? Take a look at drainage. But the big thing is dig a little and you can learn a lot. And that last one around soil testing, we've got all those soil health tests, but we also have the organic matter test. If you look in the environmental farm plan, you'll see that there's soil organic matter targets. I kind of don't like the word target. I kind of like the word guideline better. This is based on some research out of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, looking at aggregate stability and a few other aspects overall as far as what the guidelines for organic matter should be, and based on different soil textures. It gives you something to at least aim for. And so I wanted to show you this one. This is a project that I did with some nursery sod. So these are the guys who grow sod for landscaping. So every 2 years, they're rolling up a good chunk of their soil along with a lot of root system. And so we were looking at the soil health under some of these farms. And it's interesting when you look, even though they've got tremendous amount of root mass that's going back in, they're using compost and manure, it's still something you really got to look at, because most of the sites that I sampled were just barely, they're just below or just around the fair level for those soil types. And that makes it challenging, but at least with the ratings, it gives you an idea of where you fit. If you're looking for more information to build on soil health and help make some of those hard decisions over time to get that plan in place, WMAFRA does have a number of soil health resources. We've, of course, got the older Best Management Practices booklet series, which addresses a wide variety of topics, and then a newer soil health resource series. These are smaller booklets, and they are on pretty much every topic, from compaction to reduced tillage to, of course, my personal favorite, cover crops. And of course, we've also got some really great cover crop information out there, both on the WMAFRA website and also on the Midwest Cover Crop Council's website. There's both the mobile app and there's a decision tool there to aid in any cover crop decisions. And some of that work on the cover crop site is being supported by grain farmers, in that we are redoing the selector tool for Ontario and revising the ratings. What it really comes down to with soil health, it is soil management. It does require management. It requires a plan. And I recognize in tough years where there are tough decisions and you may go off plan, but there's always plan B and C. And the idea that over the longer term, you're going to maintain those 6 C's that Laura was talking about. You're going to make sure that you've got the cover crops, you've got the diverse crop rotation, you've got reduced tillage, you're managing your compaction, and basically you're working on maintaining your carbon. Thank you.
Thanks, Ann. That was a great discussion on soil health. Really appreciate that. One question for you. I was just kind of wondering, this year, 2019, there's been a fair bit of unseeded acres across the province, specifically in the Niagara region. I was just traveling through Niagara last week and saw some fields being worked up, weeds worked down, because it was the driest period that we've had this year in the Niagara Peninsula. But with, probably up to about 30% of the acres not seeded, any recommendations for some farmers as far as a go-to cover crop? Considering probably a lot of those producers are thinking of putting winter wheat in, what is their best management practice over the next month or so before they get planting?
Yeah. Well, given that it is now, July 30th,
Yeah.
there's not a big window left there for doing much. The recommendation, if it was a little bit earlier, and if the weather had cooperated, was to try and get a inexpensive cover crop in there. So you really have to consider, are you going to wheat, or is it a field that's not going to wheat? If it's going to wheat right now, if you had some cheap seed of something, or you had some bulk soybean seed that was treated that you needed to deal with, probably best thing to do is get that planted and at least cover the ground. Keeping in mind that we need to make sure that we've got that cover crop under control 2 weeks in advance, at least, before you plant the wheat. And keeping also in mind that as much as we've been frustrated with the weather this year, you don't want to jump too far ahead on your wheat planting. There's still optimum dates, and if you look at gocereals.com, there's a lovely map that shows you your optimum wheat planting dates. Now, if it's a field that's not going to wheat, July 30th, we've still got lots of options open. And I can see why they want to till, and I don't have a problem with that, but I'd really like to see a bit of a cover crop. And if they have access to any organic amendments, whether it's compost, manure, anything like that, to try and start building that soil structure back a little bit. A lot of those soils have sat so wet and so waterlogged so long this year. And we've had a fair bit of erosion and settling and ponding in areas. So I don't mind a little bit of tillage to loosen things up. It would be nice to see the cover crop. It does a great job of suppressing weeds, particularly our herbicide-resistant weeds like Canada fleabane. If we're doing tillage and using just burn-off, that's leaving that soil really, really exposed. And you just have to think about, well, just looking even at some of the fields of hay that got left out for a few days. I can see some round bales not too far from home that it was gorgeous second cut hay that was brilliant green, was almost kind of creepy how green it was. But after a few days in the sun, now it looks kind of sad and tired. It's amazing how much bleaching and how much sterilization our sun does anymore. So having a cover crop in place will suppress weeds, but at the same time, it's also going to buffer that soil life and allow it to have some shade, do some cooling, and absorb any heavy rainfall that we're likely to get. And this is the time of year where we're going to get those pop-up thunderstorms that drop 2 to 6 inches. And the potential for further erosion is huge. So trying to get a cover crop in, especially on the fields where they're not going to wheat, you've got 2.5 months of good growth before you might want to consider to control it. In which case, simple things like oats and cover crop radish. Again, coming back to the soybeans, if there's some discard soybeans around or treated soybeans, good one to pull into there. And there's also still wonderful options for anybody who needs feed. It's a warm season right now. We can get things like sorghum growing still and still get at least one cut off of that.
We have another question, and it's a little bit of a question for the both of you. So if it takes time to commit to the soil, what do you recommend as a starting point, keeping in mind that, some people might not have the capital to invest in the equipment or new equipment? Where do we start from there?
Start with rotation. Right off the bat, you start with rotation, because you're going to see the gains, as Laura showed you. You're going to see the gains in your corn and bean yields right off the bat with wheat. Then wheat is the gateway to allow you to get cover crops in there. And then cover crops can help you with your reduced tillage. Cover crops combined with strip till is a wonderful way to go. So it's kind of a progressive type of thing. And Laura's nodding at me, so I'm guessing she's agreeing.
I want to thank Ann and Laura on behalf of Grain Farmers of Ontario and all farmers of Ontario, the great information that you've provided for us. It is great for Ontario farmers to have such a wealth of resources like yourselves in the province to provide us with answers to some of the questions that we have. Soil health is something that's very important, I think, to everybody in agriculture, and we want to maintain our soils for longevity and to produce the best crops possible. But understanding soil health better and knowing how to work our soils and how to put the right crops in and capture the right nutrients is very important. And we're going to see more developments over the next few years in this area as well.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Laura, for participating. Thank you to all our guests who attended. Just to let you know, this will be posted within the next couple of days. Questions following that, please feel free to reach out to web@gfo.ca, and we will get those questions answered as soon as we can. Thank you all, and have a great day.